The 27th of June, 1977, Duluth, Minnesota. At 7 o'clock on a summer morning, a nurse arrives at Glensheen, the Congdon estate on the shore of Lake Superior. The house is a monument to another age. 39 rooms of Jacobean revival grandeur, terraced gardens descending toward the water, polished wood, old money, and the kind of permanence wealthy families build when they want to believe time will spare them. Inside, something is wrong at once. The silence feels unnatural. In a house run by routine, the smallest disruption registers immediately. The night nurse, Velma Pietila, should be awake by now. There should be footsteps, the soft mechanics of a shift change, the quiet sounds of care inside a home where an elderly heiress depends on others for nearly everything. Instead, there is only stillness. The nurse moves deeper into the mansion, past rooms designed for beauty, lineage, and display. Then, near the staircase, she sees the body. Velma Pietila is lying on the floor, bludgeoned to death. Nearby rests a brass candlestick, heavy enough to become a weapon. In an instant, the illusion of safety collapses. This is no medical emergency. This is violence. She runs upstairs. Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom is open. Drawers have been yanked out. Personal belongings are scattered. A jewelry case is gone. And in the bed lies Elizabeth herself, 83 years old, frail, partially paralyzed after a devastating stroke, dead beneath the hush of satin and linen. She has been smothered where she slept. 2 women killed in one of the most distinguished houses in the Midwest. The scene seems legible. A burglary, a wealthy home, a break-in under cover of night, a nurse surprised, an invalid silenced, valuables taken on the way out. Police reach the estate quickly, and the first explanation is simple. Someone came for money, panic took over, and 2 lives were extinguished in the process. But Glensheen was never just a house, and this was never just a crime scene. It was the physical expression of a dynasty built on iron, law, and Gilded Age ambition. It was the legacy of Chester Congdon, who turned the mineral wealth of northern Minnesota into one of the region's fortunes and raised a mansion meant to outlast him. For nearly 70 years, the house stood as proof that money could secure beauty, continuity, and control. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the less this resembled the work of a stranger. The truth, when it emerged, was colder and far more intimate. The murders at Glensheen would become one of Minnesota's most infamous criminal cases, not because of the blood alone, but because of what it revealed. Inheritance warped into motive, privilege curdled into desperation, and a family fortune transformed into a death sentence. What began in a lakeside mansion would reach back to the Mesabi iron boom and forward into courtrooms, headlines, and decades of suspicion. This is the story of a house built to preserve a family's name, and of the greed that shattered it from within. The nurse who found them has never been made part of the public mythology. Her name stayed out of the papers, as if anonymity might spare her from what she saw that morning. But on Monday, the 27th of June, 1977, just before 7 o'clock, she drove to Glensheen the way she had so many times before, expecting nothing more dramatic than the careful handoff that begins another day of private care inside a very old house. She knew the rhythms of the place. She knew which doors stuck in damp weather, which hallways carried the lake air, which rooms held the morning light. She had worked long enough for Elizabeth Congdon to understand that houses this large develop their own routines, almost their own etiquette. Even silence has a pattern in a mansion. This silence did not. From the moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere felt wrong, too still, too sealed, as though the house had closed in on itself during the night. Normally, Velma Pietila, the night nurse, would already be awake and moving. There would be the muted sounds of work in progress. Dishes, footsteps, the low practical energy of someone preparing breakfast and getting an elderly patient ready for the day. That was how it always went. 2 professionals exchanging responsibility in a house where routine mattered because frailty did. But there was no Velma in the kitchen, no sign of movement upstairs, no voice calling out from another room, only an emptiness so complete it immediately sharpened into dread. She crossed the first floor, passing through rooms that still carried the confidence of another era, reception rooms arranged for formal visiting, a library built to suggest permanence and cultivation, a breakfast room glowing with its distinctive tile and carefully composed charm. Nothing seemed visibly disturbed. Chairs were where they belonged. Tables were undisturbed. The surfaces of wealth, order, taste, control remained intact. Then she reached the staircase. Velma Pietila lay at the bottom. The violence was not ambiguous. Blood had gathered around her head. A brass candlestick, bent and ugly now, rested nearby as if the room itself had turned against her. The nurse did not stay to study the scene. She ran upstairs. Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom door was open. Drawers had been yanked out and overturned. Their contents were scattered with a carelessness that felt theatrical as much as desperate. Something was missing from the dresser. The room had been searched, or made to look searched, and there, in the bed, under covers still drawn up with almost domestic neatness, lay Elizabeth herself. For a second, the scene carried a terrible illusion of peace. Then the details resolved. The wrong color in her face, the unnatural stillness. The nurse moved toward the bed, checked for a pulse, and found nothing. A satin pillow lay nearby. Elizabeth Congdon, 83 years old, weakened by a catastrophic stroke years earlier, was dead. The call to police came fast. So did the officers. In Duluth, everyone knew Glensheen. It was more than an address. It was one of the city's grandest landmarks. A mansion that seemed to belong as much to local memory as to the family who had built it. Even in 1977, it had the aura of a preserved world. One of those rare American houses so intact, so atmospherically complete, that it already felt halfway to becoming a museum. The responding officers knew they were entering not just a crime scene, but a symbol. Inside, the evidence presented itself with unsettling clarity. Velma Pietila had not been struck once in panic. She had been beaten with force and repetition. The candlestick was not incidental. It was the instrument of a determined attack. Whatever happened on that staircase involved either fury, cold resolve, or some mixture of both. Upstairs, the second killing was quieter and somehow more chilling. Elizabeth Congdon had been almost entirely defenseless. After the stroke, she could not walk, could scarcely speak, and depended on nurses for the most basic functions of daily life. To kill her meant standing over an elderly disabled woman and holding a pillow in place long enough to feel life leave the room. It required patience, not courage, not impulse, patience. At first, the explanation seemed almost conventional. A wealthy estate on a relatively isolated stretch of valuable lakeshore, a nighttime intruder, a confrontation with the nurse, a panicked escalation, a second murder to remove a witness. There was evidence that appeared to support it. Drawers open, belongings disturbed, a jewelry box missing, a billiard room window showing signs of forced entry. But almost immediately, the story began to fray. For one thing, too little had been taken. Glensheen was full of objects a burglar would have recognized instantly. Silver, art, antiques, collections, accumulated over generations. Anyone willing to break into a house like this would have left with more than a single box. And the violence itself made little criminal sense. If the intruder had already bludgeoned Velma Pietila in a struggle, why continue upward? Why pause long enough to suffocate a woman who posed no physical threat? Then there was the window. Investigators noticed a detail that felt minor until it didn't. The glass had fallen in the wrong direction, not inward, but out. It was the sort of mistake that can betray a staged entry, the small technical error made by someone imitating a break-in rather than committing one. By late morning, detectives were no longer asking only what had happened inside the house. They were asking a different, older question: who profited? Who knew the layout of Glensheen well enough to navigate it in darkness? Who knew Elizabeth's physical condition? Who knew that Velma Pietila, on the night shift, was the only real barrier between the heiress and anyone who wished her harm? The answers narrowed quickly. Elizabeth Congdon had 2 adopted daughters. Jennifer lived quietly and maintained stable relations with the family. Marjorie did not. Marjorie Congdon Loy Caldwell came with a reputation, financial chaos, emotional volatility, years of crisis and rescue. And within hours, investigators began learning just how desperate her situation had become. She was in Colorado. She was broke. Her home had been lost. Cars had been repossessed. She and her husband, Roger Caldwell, were living in a hotel because they could not manage a more stable arrangement. He had no meaningful employment. Family trustees had cut off access to larger sums. Requests for money had become a pattern. And then came the detail that shifted suspicion into something colder. 3 months earlier, in March of 1977, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had warned the Congdon trustees about information they had received. Marjorie, they were told, had been trying to find someone to kill her mother. Security at Glensheen had been tightened after that. But Elizabeth refused to believe the threat came from within her own family. She dismissed the warnings. She insisted her daughter loved her. She insisted no such thing was possible. Now she was dead in her own bed, and the house her father built as a monument to family permanence had become the setting for an accusation almost too grotesque to accept, that a daughter had set death in motion for the sake of inheritance. The murders at Glensheen shocked Minnesota, not simply because 2 women had been killed, but because of the world in which they had been killed. This was not anonymous urban violence. This was a prominent family, an iconic estate, a beloved invalid, and the nurse who cared for her. It was money, lineage, dependence, resentment, and the peculiar claustrophobia of inherited wealth all collapsing at once. The case would consume years' investigations, trials, reversals, confessions, acquittals, and a public argument over whether the legal system had uncovered the truth or merely arranged the available facts into something it could live with. But the story does not really begin with murder. It begins with the fortune that made Glensheen possible in the first place. Before the courtroom, before the scandal, before the family turned on itself, there was Chester Congdon, a struggling lawyer who found his way into the explosive wealth of the Iron Country and built a house meant to secure his name for generations. That fortune created the world inside Glensheen, and in the end, it created the motive for everything that followed. Before Glensheen became a house of inheritance, suspicion, and death, it began as the ambition of one man who was not born to grandeur. Chester Congdon entered the world on the 12th of June, 1853, in Rochester, New York, the son of a Methodist minister and a mother from a respectable but far from affluent family. Nothing in those beginnings suggested a Gilded Age titan in the making. His early life seems to have been shaped by the familiar disciplines of the Protestant middle-class duty: thrift, restraint, the belief that success was earned slowly and at cost. He did not inherit a fortune. He inherited expectations: work hard, live seriously, build what you can. That distinction matters, because men who create wealth often carry a different kind of hunger than those merely born into it. In Chester's case, the hunger appears early, not as swagger, but as anxiety. He was intelligent, ambitious, and painfully aware that intelligence alone does not secure position. In 1871, he entered Syracuse University. There he met Clara Hesperia Bannister, the daughter of another Methodist minister, this one from San Francisco. Their lives were parallel in a way that must have felt comforting. Religious households, education taken seriously, futures imagined through discipline rather than glamour. They graduated in 1875. Chester turned toward the law. Clara took up teaching at a women's college in Ontario. They stayed connected across distance, writing letters, planning a life together that, at least for the moment, existed mostly in hope. Hope, however, is expensive when one is young and underpaid. The years after graduation were lean. Chester read law in Syracuse, was admitted to the New York bar in 1877, and discovered what many aspiring professionals discovered too late. Credentials do not guarantee momentum. Clients were scarce. Money was scarcer. In letters to Clara, he revealed a sharp, almost humiliating self-awareness, doubting his own talent, mocking his prospects, wondering if he had chosen the wrong life altogether. There is something revealing in those moments. Before he ever became a wealthy man, he understood the insult of near failure. In 1878, needing income more than prestige, he accepted a position as a school principal in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. It was not a glamorous detour. It was the sort of compromise men make when ambition has not yet learned how to feed itself. The work did not suit him. The pay was poor. He lasted pahot than a year before moving on again. In 1879, he went to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he was admitted to the Minnesota bar and opened a practice. For a time, his life settled into that uneasy condition common to respectable strivers. He was getting by, but only just. Then fortune, in the form it often takes, arrived as a relationship. He met William Bilson, the U, S. District Attorney for Minnesota. Bilson recognized something in him: ability, discipline, usefulness, and when an opportunity opened, Chester became his assistant. The salary was not transformative, but the appointment gave him something more valuable than money: access. It placed him near power, near influence, near the sort of professional networks from which larger destinies are made. With slightly steadier footing, Chester finally did what he had been postponing for years. He borrowed money, proposed to Clara, and on the 29th of September, 1881, 10 years after they first met, they married. Their early married life in Street Paul was comfortable only in the most modest sense of the word. Chester continued in public legal work. They lived on Selby Avenue, close enough to the fashionable world of Summit Avenue to see it, but not yet wealthy enough to join it. That small geographic detail says a great deal. They were near privilege, not inside it. Near arrival, not arrived. Children followed Walter, then Edward, then Marjorie. The family grew. So did the expenses. Chester's income, though respectable, stretched thin under the weight of real life. Then came Duluth. In 1892, Bilson, who had moved on from government service and established a private practice there, invited Chester to join him. Duluth at that moment was no provincial outpost. It was becoming one of the most dynamic cities in the upper Midwest, a place electrified by shipping, capital, and the discovery of vast ore deposits to the north. The Mesabi Range had altered the economic geography of the region. Rail lines, legal disputes, mineral claims, industrial speculation. Money was beginning to move at a scale that demanded not just labor, but lawyers. Chester accepted. He and Clara relocated in May 1892, entering a city on the rise. Their new firm quickly gained standing in civil litigation, and for a brief moment, it seemed the move had given them the upward trajectory they had been chasing for years. But prosperity rarely arrives without its shadow. In 1893, their young son, John Robert, died of scarlet fever. The loss was devastating. It is easy, in stories of wealth, to let grief disappear behind balance sheets and buildings. But the Congdons' life in Duluth was marked from early on by that intimate contradiction: assent in public, sorrow in private. They buried their child there. They continued on. Another daughter, Elizabeth, was born in 1894, and later a son, Robert. The family expanded even as it carried absence. By 1896, the Congdons had purchased a substantial new home on East Superior Street, a 3-story house of red sandstone designed by one of Duluth's leading architects. It was elegant, established, unmistakably aspirational. Not a palace, not yet, but it signaled that Chester was no longer merely surviving. He was becoming visible. The true transformation, however, did not come from domestic respectability. It came from awe. The Mesabi Range, discovered only a few years earlier, held staggering reserves of iron ore close enough to the surface to be mined efficiently and at immense scale. At first, some industrialists dismissed it. Deposits this rich seemed almost implausible, but Henry Oliver, the Pittsburgh steel magnate, saw what others had not fully trusted: that northern Minnesota could reshape the economics of American steel. When Oliver came to Duluth in 1892 and sought legal representation, chance placed him before Chester Congdon rather than the senior figure he had expected to meet. That encounter changed everything. The two men understood one another almost immediately. Oliver needed a capable agent in Minnesota, someone to negotiate leases, secure mineral properties, manage legal complexities, and move quickly in a volatile environment. Chester was exactly that man. Their arrangement gave him what ambitious professionals dream of and almost never receive: a seat near the engine of industrial expansion. He would represent Oliver's mining interests in Minnesota in exchange for fees, commissions, and, crucially, stock. This last detail is where the story turns. Salary builds a life. Equity builds a dynasty. For years, Chester worked relentlessly. He acquired land, negotiated claims, managed disputes, and attached himself to the legal and financial machinery of extraction. His reputation sharpened. His wealth grew. And then the larger predators arrived. Rockefeller wanted influence over the range. Carnegie, having initially dismissed the ore, reconsidered and moved aggressively. What had begun as regional opportunity became a contest among national giants. Chester found himself operating within a struggle whose scale exceeded anything he could have imagined in his underpaid early years. Iron was not merely a commodity, it was the raw material of modern power. Whoever controlled it would shape railroads, factories, cities, and fortunes. In 1901, J.P. Morgan imposed order on the chaos, consolidating competing interests into United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. It was one of those moments when capitalism changes size, when industry stops looking like business and starts looking like empire. For the men inside the deal, the rewards were enormous. Chester was among them. Because he held stock connected to Oliver's interests, the consolidation multiplied his wealth with astonishing speed. In a matter of years, he went from prosperous lawyer to one of the richest men in Minnesota. And like many men who make one fortune, he did not stop there. He bought mining land others underestimated, backed processing infrastructure, profited when that land became strategically useful, and spread his investments into copper, irrigation, agriculture, banking, and corporate boards. He was no longer simply successful. He had crossed into another class of American life altogether. By 1904, Chester Congdon had become something his younger self might hardly have recognized, a man of enormous wealth, civic standing, and regional consequence. He retired from active law practice at 51, financially secure beyond the scale he had once struggled even to imagine. He and Clara had a large family, a respected name, and a place in Duluth society. But for men like Chester, wealth is rarely satisfied with invisibility. Money wants form, it wants architecture. It wants stone, wood, acreage, and view lines. It wants to be translated into something that can outlast the man who made it. So Chester began to imagine not merely a home, but a statement. A great house on the shore of Lake Superior, a family seat, a monument to a rival. Something that would announce, quietly but unmistakably, that the era of striving was over. In 1905, he began planning the estate that would become Glensheen. Chester and Clara Congdon did not set out to build a vulgar monument. They spent months deciding what the estate should be and, just as importantly, what it should not. They studied architecture seriously, traveled east, and walked through the great houses of older American fortunes. They had seen enough to know the difference between grandeur and display. This would not be a Midwestern imitation of Fifth Avenue theater. It would not beg for approval from New York. What they wanted was something more disciplined, more enduring, a house of consequence, built for family life, designed to suggest permanence without spectacle. The site they chose was itself a kind of declaration. 12 wooded acres on the shore of Lake Superior, bracketed by Tisha Creek and Bent Brook, sloping from London Road down toward the water. In 1905, it felt almost remote from downtown Duluth. Quiet, spacious, touched more by wind and trees than by city noise. Clara, with dry wit, wrote that she would have quiet neighbors, a reference to the cemetery nearby. It was exactly the sort of line that reveals the sensibility behind Glensheen, cultivated, understated, faintly amused by the solemnities of wealth. The land offered everything they wanted: privacy, elevation, a dramatic lakeside setting, and the illusion, so important to houses of this type, that a family might live not merely in comfort but in its own carefully ordered world. To give that world form, Chester hired Clarence H. Johnston, the most respected architect in Minnesota. Johnston understood the practical demands of the climate as well as the symbolic demands of money. He knew how to design a house that could survive brutal winters and still communicate authority. The style he proposed was Jacobean revival, drawn loosely from English country houses of the 17th century. Asymmetry, brick and granite, tall chimneys, strong gables, mullioned windows, surfaces that implied age even when newly built. It carried the weight of history without seeming imported whole from Europe. That balance mattered. Glensheen was meant to feel established, not theatrical old in spirit, but American in purpose. For the landscape, the Congdons turned to Charles W. Levitt Jr. of New York, who sent two young designers, Anthony Morell and Arthur Nichols, to supervise the work on site. Interiors were entrusted to William A. French and Company. From the beginning, the ambition was total. House, grounds, circulation, furnishings, service systems, everything was to belong to one coherent vision, not a mansion assembled in pieces, but an environment. Construction began in 1905 and continued for nearly 4 years. The site itself resisted easy conquest. It was thickly wooded and fell sharply toward the lake, which meant the builders had to clear, grade, and shape the property without destroying the natural beauty that justified the location in the first place. Like many great estates, Glensheen was built on the tension between intervention and preservation. Nature disciplined, but not erased. Chester wanted the property to be modern in the way only the richest houses of the era could be: modern, efficient, hidden, seamless. Utilities were routed underground so that pipes, wires, and mechanical necessities would not interrupt the visual order of the landscape. Water, gas, and electrical service entered discreetly. Heating infrastructure was handled with the same care. A large reservoir was created to support the gardens, drawing from Tisha Creek. Even now, that system remains part of the estate's long physical memory. Levitt shaped the grounds to preserve the site's native character. Birch, maple, and spruce were retained wherever possible. Trails wound through the woods, small bridges crossed the ravines. The drive curved with the land rather than cutting across it in a gesture of domination. Yet the estate was also designed to function as a largely self-contained domain. There were formal gardens, of course, but also working elements: vegetable plots, greenhouse space, orchards, livestock facilities, gardeners' cottages, courts and lawns for leisure, a boathouse and pier, extending the property's logic all the way to the lake. Like many elite American estates of the period, Glensheen presented itself as gracious domestic life, while depending on a substantial infrastructure of labor, planning, and money concealed just out of sight. The house itself rose with quiet authority: 39 rooms, roughly 20,000 square feet, a scale large enough to impress, but handled so carefully that the finished result never tipped into hostility. This is one of Glensheen's great achievements. It has stature without losing intimacy. The interiors were richly detailed, but never chaotic. Different woods were assigned to different rooms: mahogany, walnut, cypress, oak, birch, creating subtle variations in mood and identity throughout the house. Furnishings were chosen to correspond with the architecture, rather than compete with it. Hallways carried decorative stenciling with an arts and crafts sensibility. Doors were built with unusual care, often presenting one wood to the corridor and another to the room within, as though every threshold deserved its own act of design. Surfaces mattered. So did atmosphere. Textiles, carved wood, glass, metalwork, and wall finishes were selected to create layers of warmth rather than sheer opulence. The result was expensive, unquestionably, but not merely expensive looking. It had intelligence behind it. And it had technology: central heating, humidification, a central vacuum system, gas and electric lighting operating side by side, because electricity in that era could not yet be fully trusted. The lower level contained the hidden mechanics of upper-class life: laundry, storage, service rooms, workspaces for staff. But it also included leisure and display billiard areas, recreation spaces, rooms for collections, because great houses have always depended on that peculiar fusion of utility and performance. Below stairs, labor; above stairs, ease. And the easier the life appears, the more labor has generally disappeared from view. Throughout the house, motifs reinforced the Congdons' chosen self-image. Lions appeared as symbols of strength and command. Pineapples signaled hospitality. It was a familiar language among wealthy households, power made legible, then softened by ritual welcome. The message was elegant and unmistakable. This was a family that had risen and knew it, but wished to present authority with civility. Some rooms were especially memorable. The breakfast room, designed by John Scott Bradstreet, became one of the most distinctive interiors in the house, with luminous green tile and stained glass light opening toward the terraces and the lake beyond. The library and dining room also took full advantage of the view, bringing the landscape inward so that the estate seemed not simply placed on the shore, but in conversation with it. Outside, formal gardens descended in measured terraces toward the water, translating wealth into geometry. Inside, the grand staircase rose as the house's central gesture, less a practical route between floors than a piece of domestic theatre, executed with enough craftsmanship to justify the drama. By the time construction was complete, the cost had climbed to $854,000, an immense sum then, the equivalent of many millions now. Chester paid it. Not extravagantly, not apologetically. He believed he was buying permanence. The family moved in on the 24th of November 1908. They called the house Glensheen, a name drawn from ancestral associations and the ravines that framed the site. It was now fully alive, furnished, staffed, planted, operational. The estate Chester had imagined had become real. It announced success, certainly, but it also did something subtler. It translated new industrial wealth into the language of legacy. It asked to be read not as a businessman's indulgence, but as a family seat. In that sense, Glensheen was a triumph. It was beautiful, technologically advanced, thoughtfully designed, and unusually livable for a house of its size. More than a century later, that remains part of its power. The place never dissolved into cold magnificence. It kept a domestic pulse. Chester was 55 when the house was finished. He had climbed from modest beginnings to extraordinary wealth and built the estate that would define his family's public image. But he enjoyed it for less than a decade. In November 1916, he died suddenly, at 63, of a pulmonary embolism. The life had been astonishingly successful and, in a deeper sense, abruptly unfinished. Clara remained. For the next 34 years, she preserved the house with disciplined devotion, maintaining the interiors, the gardens, the atmosphere, the precise order Chester had established. Glensheen became her stewardship, her memorial, her daily act of fidelity. But houses like this are never only about the people who build them. They are also about the people who inherit them and what inheritance does to a family over time. The next act of Glensheen would belong not to Chester, but to the youngest daughter, Elizabeth, the girl who grew up first in the family's earlier house, then came of age inside these rooms. She would remain at Glensheen for the rest of her life. She would make the estate her world. She would raise her adopted daughters there. And decades later, in one of the bedrooms of this carefully ordered house, she would die in the dark, at the center of the tragedy that made Glensheen immortal for reasons its builders never intended. For Glensheen to appear effortless, it required an extraordinary amount of effort. The house was designed to project ease-orderly rooms, polished silver, gardens descending toward Lake Superior, a family moving through wealth as though such abundance were the most natural condition in the world. But houses of that scale do not run on elegance alone. They run on systems, and systems run on people. In its prime, Glensheen depended on a staff of roughly 20 to 30 men and women to sustain the illusion that comfort simply happened. This was not an attempt to recreate an English court in the Minnesota woods. The Congdons were not staging an aristocratic fantasy so much as building a highly disciplined American household, one capable of accommodating children, guests, formal obligations, and the daily demands of a large estate. Still, the structure of service was unmistakably hierarchical. The butler supervised the male staff and formal household operations. The housekeeper governed the domestic interior, its standards, schedules, and the women who maintained it. Beneath them worked cooks, maids, laundresses, footmen, kitchen workers, gardeners, and groundsmen, each person fitted into a clearly defined chain of responsibility. The machine functioned because everyone understood their place inside it. The staff lived largely out of sight, in small, functional quarters on the upper floors. Those rooms were plain, practical, and stripped of the visual richness that characterized the family's spaces below. Service staircases allowed movement through the house without interrupting the family's life. That separation was part of the design. In great houses, labor is most successful when it becomes almost invisible, present in every polished surface and every hot meal, but rarely allowed to declare itself as labor. By the standards of their class and time, the Congdons appear to have run Glensheen without particular cruelty. Wages were decent. Conditions, while hardly equal, were more stable than in many wealthy households. Clara, especially, seems to have preferred competence over theatrical authority. She expected order, but not hysteria. Staff who did their work well often remained for years, and that continuity became part of the estate's atmosphere. Glensheen was not simply inhabited by one family. It was sustained by a much larger human structure, most of it concealed. Within that structure, daily life settled into a rhythm that was both formal and intimate. Chester kept offices downtown, but he also worked from the library, a room that held thousands of volumes and something of his inner life. Legal texts, history, literature, the intellectual furnishings of a man who had built himself upward and intended never to seem merely rich. He could sit there for hours, reading, writing letters, managing business, or thinking through the problems of a fortune that, even after it had been made, required careful tending. Clara oversaw the domestic world with equal seriousness. She raised the children, managed the staff, handled social obligations, and enforced the kind of routines wealthy households rely on to prevent comfort from tipping into chaos. By the time the family moved into Glensheen in 1908, the children were old enough for the house to become not just a setting, but a childhood. Walter, Edward, Marjorie, Helen, Elizabeth, and Robert moved through the new estate as though it were both playground and inheritance. Another son, John, had died years earlier in infancy, a quiet absence that remained part of the family story even as the surviving children filled the house with movement. For them, Glensheen was not a museum of wealth. It was home. They roamed the wooded grounds, followed the paths through the trees, used the courts, approached the lakeshore as if it belonged to them, because, in the most literal sense, it did. Winter brought skating. Summer brought swimming, boating, and the sort of expansive, supervised freedom only very large properties can provide. The estate was effectively a private landscape arranged around one family's life. Meals helped bind that life together. The formal dining room could receive a considerable number of guests, but on ordinary evenings the table was often occupied by the family itself, perhaps with a few visitors folded into the ritual. The room's scale and decoration suggested ceremony, tall windows, textile color, the glow of silver under candlelight, but the human details cut through the grandeur. Preserved traces of the household revealed tastes that were not always lofty. Even in one of the grand houses of the Midwest, someone still wanted familiar condiments on the table. Wealth changes many things. It does not eliminate habit. Morning belonged to the breakfast room, one of Glensheen's most distinctive spaces, where green tile and light combined to create something unusually vivid and intimate. It became the daily center of the house. Clara understood the symbolic value of routine, especially in a family large enough to drift into separate lives. Breakfast together was less about sentimentality than governance. A household begins the day as it means to continue it. Art, too, was woven into the family's everyday life. Chester collected American painters and placed their work throughout the house, not as decoration alone, but as part of the atmosphere he wanted to cultivate. The paintings were not locked away for special viewing. They were lived among. Glensheen functioned as both domestic space and private gallery, which is one of the ways wealth tries to humanize itself, by surrounding power with culture. Guests came often: dinners, teas, calls, seasonal entertainments. The estate was never purely private. Wealth of this kind was always partly social. A great house had to perform hospitality as convincingly as it performed status. The gardens became a stage for that performance. So did Clara herself, who managed receptions with the assurance of someone who understood that a family's position had to be maintained not only through money, but through manners, visibility, and discipline. Chester, meanwhile, did not retreat into decorative gentility. Even after stepping back from full-time law practice, he remained deeply engaged in business and politics. He served on boards, pursued investments, and eventually entered the Minnesota legislature in defense of his iron interests. His opposition to a proposed tax on ore shipments was not ideological in the abstract. It was personal. His fortune was linked to the mining economy, and he intended to protect it. That too is part of the Glensheen story. The house was not merely built by money, it was defended by political influence. Like so many elite estates, it rested on a network of decisions made far beyond its gates. During those years, one child in particular became inseparable from the place. Elizabeth Congdon, born in 1894, was 14 when the family moved into Glensheen. For her, the house was not the culmination of ambition, as it had been for Chester, but the central fact of emotional life. She grew into adulthood within its rooms. She knew the paths, the gardens, the lake light, the seasonal moods of the estate. And unlike her siblings, she never developed much appetite for departure. Others left. College, marriage, independent households, the onward movement expected of children born into privilege. Elizabeth did not. She participated in the social life available to a woman of her class and time. She had friends. She traveled from time to time. But she remained anchored to Glensheen in a way that would define the rest of her life. She never married. For a woman of her generation, especially one with financial security, that was neither shocking nor necessarily sad. Marriage was not the only available script. Some women chose a form of domestic sovereignty instead. Elizabeth's sovereignty, if that is the word, was Glensheen. Then, in November 1916, the foundation of the household shifted. Chester died suddenly at 63, still active, still influential, still imagining future projects. His death stunned Duluth. Public tributes emphasized the scale of his achievements, industrial, civic, political, philanthropic, while the private reality was simpler and more severe. The family lost the man who had built not just its fortune, but its setting. His wealth was placed into structures meant to protect it from dissipation. Trusts, income streams, delayed distributions, the usual architecture of elite continuity. These arrangements were designed to preserve the fortune across generations and prevent it from being broken apart by any one heir's weakness. In theory, it was prudent. In practice, as the future would show, money can be legally protected and emotionally ruinous at the same time. Clara stayed on at Glensheen and, in a sense, became its custodian. She maintained the interiors, the staff, the gardens, and the routines with extraordinary steadiness. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the house remained not merely occupied, but preserved. Family gatherings continued. Grandchildren came and went. Holidays were observed. The estate acquired what many great houses acquire in their second generation, the melancholy dignity of continuity. It was no longer a new monument to a rival. It was becoming an established world unto itself. Clara presided over that world for decades. She outlived Chester by 34 years and remained intellectually and domestically formidable well into old age. Staff respected her. Family members deferred to her. By the time she died in 1950 at the age of 96, Glensheen had become one of Duluth's defining landmarks, not just because of its architecture, but because it still seemed to contain the original family life for which it had been built. After Clara's death, however, the practical question emerged with new force. Who would carry the estate forward? The answer, almost inevitably, was Elizabeth. The other children had built lives elsewhere, and perhaps more importantly, had no desire to shoulder the staggering expense of such a property. A house like Glensheen was beautiful, but beauty on that scale is expensive. Heating alone in a Minnesota winter was no small matter. Add taxes, repairs, staff, landscape maintenance, deferred restoration, and the romance of inheritance begins to look a great deal like obligation. Elizabeth accepted it because, in a way, she had never really left it. By then she was already in middle age and still unmarried. The house passed to her not as an interruption, but as the continuation of what had always been true. Glensheen was her life. Yet even a beloved house can become too large in the absence of children. Elizabeth solved that problem by creating a family of her own. In 1932, she adopted an infant girl and renamed her Marjorie Mannering Congdon. 3 years later, she adopted a second daughter, Jennifer Susan Congdon. The estate, which had grown quieter as the original generation dispersed, filled again with the sound of young lives. There were nurses, nannies, school plans, children's routines, social introductions, all the familiar machinery of privilege beginning again. For a time, the arrangement restored a kind of domestic animation to Glensheen. The girls grew up with the same views, the same grounds, the same assumptions of comfort and importance that had shaped Elizabeth. But the family was no longer seamless in the old way. Adoption may have made the girls legally Congdons, but not everyone in the wider family treated them as fully interchangeable with blood heirs. Such distinctions are often delivered softly in wealthy families through tone, through preference, through invisible lines of belonging. Jennifer seems to have moved through that world with relative ease. Marjorie did not. She was more volatile, more demanding, harder to manage. Whether by temperament, insecurity, or some combination of both, she required more attention and generated more strain. Elizabeth loved her, but love is not the same thing as mastery. Even within the stately order of Glensheen, disorder had begun to take a more intimate form. The house, meanwhile, hardly changed. That is one of the reasons it remains so powerful today. While families evolved, fractured, and aged, the rooms held their positions. Furniture remained where it had been placed. The gardens were maintained. The interior life of 1908 survived deep into the 20th century with unusually little interruption. Time seemed to pass around Glensheen more than through it. Then came 1964. Elizabeth suffered a devastating stroke at 70. The event altered everything at once. She lost mobility, much of her speech, and the ability to care for herself. The woman who had effectively embodied the continuity of the house now depended on others for nearly every basic act: eating, dressing, moving, speaking. Nurses were brought in for day shifts and night shifts. The old household, once governed by habit and authority, now turned on caregiving. 4 years later, in 1968, Elizabeth made a decision at once, practical and elegant. She donated Glensheen to the University of Minnesota Duluth, retaining the right to live there for the rest of her life. It was a recognition of reality. No private heir wanted the burden of preserving the estate indefinitely. The future of the house, if it was to survive intact, would have to become institutional. That choice preserved Glensheen, but it also changed its meaning. The house was no longer simply a residence awaiting the next generation. It was already, in effect, becoming a historic site, while its owner still lived inside it. Elizabeth remained there through the 1970s, increasingly fragile, confined to a wheelchair, dependent on constant care. Her mind, by most accounts, stayed comparatively clear. She could still recognize people, she could still express wishes, but physically she had become helpless inside the house she had known all her life. By 1977, she was 83 years old and could not safely be left alone. Nurses moved through the rooms where servants, children, and guests had once moved. Outside, the gardens still held their shape. The lake still lay beyond the terraces. The house still projected composure. And yet the family beneath that composure had begun to rot in ways the architecture could not conceal. Elizabeth did not know the full extent of Marjorie's financial collapse in Colorado. She did not know how desperate her daughter had become, or how thoroughly the trustees had closed ranks around the money. She did not know how quickly inheritance can turn love into calculation when large sums sit just beyond reach. The terrible irony is almost too clean. Chester Congdon built Glensheen to secure a legacy across generations, to give his family beauty, permanence, and protection. Instead, the house endured while the family weakened inside it, and in June of 1977, that weakening reached its final expression. A nurse would be murdered on the staircase. Elizabeth would be suffocated in her bedroom. The estate, built to preserve continuity, would become the setting for one of Minnesota's most infamous crimes. The house remained, the dream did not. Elizabeth Mannering Congdon was born on the 22nd of April, 1894, into a family already ascending, but not yet fully enthroned. She entered the world at the Redstone, the Congdons' earlier house on Superior Street, before Glensheen existed as stone, timber, and inheritance. She was Chester and Clara Congdon's fifth child, though only the fourth to survive beyond infancy. A detail that mattered more in families of that era than later generations sometimes remember. Even before wealth stabilized a household, loss had already visited it. She grew up watching money harden into status. When Elizabeth was young, her father was still a man in motion, building his position through law, ore, and investment, converting regional opportunity into something closer to dynasty. By the time she was 14, that ascent had found its architectural expression. In 1908, the family moved into Glensheen, and the house that would later become inseparable from her name became the central fact of her life. Unlike some of her siblings, Elizabeth did not seem restless. Others moved outward, as children of prosperous families often do, toward marriage, profession, independence, separate households, some version of selfhood beyond the family estate. Elizabeth did not resist the world she had been given. She seemed, instead, to inhabit it, with unusual ease. She attended the right schools, moved through Duluth society with the expected grace, maintained friendships among families of similar standing, and traveled enough to understand that life existed elsewhere. But she always returned to the house on Lake Superior. That return became a pattern, then an identity. She never married. For a woman of her class, that was not scandal but circumstance. Plenty of affluent women in the early 20th century remained unmarried, either by temperament, timing, or choice, and built meaningful lives around family management, civic engagement, culture, philanthropy, and the social obligations that came with money. Elizabeth appears to have settled naturally into that role. She was the daughter who remained close, the reliable one, the one who helped Clara oversee the household, understand the staff, maintain the family's social presence, and preserve the domestic world Chester had spent so much to build. Then Chester died in 1916, and the house changed without changing at all. Elizabeth was only 22, still young enough that marriage might easily have followed. But the years passed. No decisive romantic story replaced the life she already had. Instead, her bond with Glensheen deepened. She became, gradually and almost imperceptibly, part of its fixed architecture, another permanent feature of the estate, as expected as the staircase or the lake beyond the terrace. When Clara died in 1950, Elizabeth inherited not only a mansion, but the strange emotional burden of being left almost alone inside it. She was 56 years old, unmarried, and living in a house built for a large family, for generations, for continuity, enacted daily in rooms too numerous to fill with one person's life. It is tempting to sentimentalize such solitude, but the reality was likely more complicated. There was beauty, certainly. There was security, there was prestige, but there was also scale, and scale can become its own form of loneliness. To live in 39 rooms is not merely to possess space. It is to hear absence amplified. The staff remained, the routines remained. Yet servants, however loyal, do not erase the fact that they are paid to stay. Elizabeth's answer to that emptiness was not retreat, but expansion. In 1932, she adopted an infant girl and gave her the name Marjorie Mannering Congdon. The choice of name mattered. By attaching her own middle name and the family surname to the child, Elizabeth was doing more than providing a home. She was conferring position, identity, and entry into a lineage. 3 years later, she adopted a second daughter, Jennifer Susan Congdon. Suddenly, Glensheen had children again. Nurseries were prepared, nannies and nurses were employed. The house, long defined by adult order and inherited ritual, absorbed the disarray of childhood. There were toys in rooms meant for polished formality, voices in hallways once quiet, small feet running over floors built for processional dignity. Elizabeth appears to have embraced motherhood with seriousness and devotion. She was older than many new mothers of her time, but wealth made age easier to manage. Help was always available. Night feedings, childcare, household administration, those could be delegated. Love and intention could not. The girls grew up in privilege that was both real and carefully curated. They had excellent clothes, proper schooling, summer excursions, sports, lake air, etiquette, and the visual education that comes from being raised inside a house where beauty is embedded in daily life. They learned to move through the world as Congdons, or at least that was the hope. Yet the family story darkens here in ways that later seem almost too neat, as though the future were already testing its shadows across the floor. From early on, Marjorie proved difficult. Not merely spirited, not merely spoiled in the ordinary sense, but volatile, demanding, emotional, exhausting to manage. The adults around her noticed it. Nurses struggled. Rules became occasions for battle. Attention, once granted, seemed only to create a hunger for more attention. Jennifer, by contrast, was easier, calmer, more compliant, more readily folded into the expected patterns of upper-class girlhood. The difference between the sisters soon became impossible to ignore. There was another complication as well, subtler but no less consequential. Adoption made the girls legal Congdons, but elite families are often less modern in private than they appear in public. Certain relatives, though outwardly polite, never seemed to have granted the adoptions full emotional equality. Lines remained unspoken but felt. Blood versus belonging. Inherited place versus bestowed place. Jennifer may have sensed those nuances without being consumed by them. Marjorie seems to have experienced them as injury. Whether that rejection created her instability or merely sharpened, it is impossible to say. What matters is that resentment found a place to root. As Marjorie entered adolescence, the pattern worsened. She spent recklessly, demanded constantly, and treated money less as a tool than as proof of love. Limits, when imposed, became personal betrayal. Elizabeth tried what mothers in her position often try: patience, explanation, indulgence, rescue, perhaps professional advice, perhaps private pleading. None of it seems to have altered the trajectory. Marjorie remained erratic, manipulative, and financially undisciplined, a daughter who converted family feeling into permanent crisis. In 1951, at 19, she married Richard Loy. Children followed quickly, 7 in all. What should have grounded her instead appears to have widened the chaos. Bills accumulated, debts multiplied, the household overspent. When money ran out, Marjorie turned to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, again and again, paid. This is one of the central tragedies of wealthy families. Love often arrives disguised as rescue, and rescue, repeated often enough, becomes the architecture of disaster. Elizabeth covered debts, softened consequences, and made it possible for patterns to continue that should long since have broken under their own weight. Jennifer's life moved in the opposite direction. She married, remained comparatively stable, preserved her place within the family, without public drama, and seems to have caused Elizabeth far less pain. The contrast between the sisters must have been difficult to bear. One daughter, a source of peace, the other, an engine of dread. Yet mothers do not distribute devotion according to merit. Elizabeth continued to help Marjorie, perhaps because she believed support might eventually produce stability, perhaps because she could not bear to refuse her, perhaps because wealth had always given the family the illusion that any problem could be brought down to size. Then, in 1964, Elizabeth's own body betrayed her. The stroke was massive and sudden. At 70, she lost the autonomy around which she had organized her life. She could no longer walk. Her speech was badly impaired. The woman who had presided over Glensheen for decades became dependent on others for movement, nourishment, hygiene, medication, safety, everything. She required round-the-clock care. Nurses took over the functions of daily life. They moved her from bed to chair, fed her, dressed her, watched over her, interpreted her gestures, and preserved what dignity could be preserved when independence has been stripped away. That, perhaps, was the cruelest dimension of her condition. Her mind remained present. She could understand. She could recognize people. She could know what had been taken from her. In 1968, she made a decision that was both practical and elegiac. She arranged for Glensheen to pass, after her death, to the University of Minnesota, Duluth. She retained the right to live there for the rest of her life, but the house itself would become institutional, preserved rather than partitioned. It was an acknowledgement that the estate's future could no longer depend on family continuity. No private heir wanted the burden. The costs were too large. The age of great domestic staffs was ending. The house would survive only if it ceased, in some sense, to be entirely a house. Meanwhile, the family money remained governed by trusts, precisely the sort of structure old fortunes create to protect wealth from appetite. Trustees controlled principal and distributions. Marjorie received income, but not freedom. Large sums remained inaccessible while Elizabeth lived. By the mid-1970s, this arrangement had become intolerable to Marjorie, whose financial life was in ruins. She needed money immediately. The trustees refused. Elizabeth, immobilized and barely able to speak, could not effectively intervene, even if she wished to. And so the family reached a terrible impasse. A mother rich on paper, a daughter desperate in reality, and an inheritance so large it distorted every relationship around it. Elizabeth spent her final years largely in a second-floor bedroom, looking out over the same lake she had known since girlhood. Few people had ever belonged so completely to a house. She had lived at Glensheen longer than Chester, longer than Clara, longer than anyone. She had survived the rise of the family, the death of its founder, the long widowhood of the house, and its transfer into the modern era. What she could not see from that window was the full shape of the danger closing around her. She could not know how desperate Marjorie had become in Colorado. She could not know how thoroughly money, resentment, and frustration had fused into something more dangerous than need. She could not know that the house built to shelter continuity had become the perfect stage for betrayal. On the night of the 26th of June, 1977, someone entered Glensheen, moved through its darkness, killed the nurse, standing between Elizabeth and the rest of the world, climbed the stairs, and pressed a pillow over the face of the woman who had spent nearly her entire life inside those walls. In the end, Elizabeth Congdon became what women like her so often become in stories of wealth. Not merely an heiress, but a custodian of memory, a keeper of a fading order, and finally, a victim of the very inheritance that was supposed to protect her. Marjorie Congdon entered the story under another name. She was born Jacqueline Barnes, an infant whose first future had already collapsed before she could remember it. In 1932, Elizabeth Congdon adopted her, brought her into Glensheen, and gave her something far more powerful than comfort: a surname, a lineage, a place inside one of Minnesota's most prominent families. In a house built to preserve continuity, adoption was meant to feel like renewal. A child had been brought in, the line would continue, the great rooms would not stand empty forever. But almost from the beginning, something in Marjorie resisted order. As a little girl, she was difficult in ways that went beyond ordinary childhood mischief. Her moods could turn suddenly and last for hours. Small frustrations became dramas. Denial of a toy, a request, a whim, did not register as disappointment but as insult. Elizabeth, who wanted to believe love could smooth what life had broken, interpreted these early storms generously. Perhaps it was insecurity, perhaps some early wound, perhaps the confusion of adoption, the psychic dislocation of belonging and not quite belonging at the same time. She sought advice, consulted specialists, tried different strategies. Nothing seemed to alter the essential pattern. Jennifer, adopted 3 years later, made the contrast impossible to ignore. Where Marjorie was volatile, Jennifer was composed. Where Marjorie demanded, Jennifer adapted. One girl moved through the rituals of Glensheen with relative ease. The other seemed perpetually at war with limits. Even in wealthy families, especially in wealthy families, comparisons like that harden quickly into judgment. By adolescence, Marjorie had become the family problem everyone recognized and no one knew how to solve. She developed the sort of entitlement that startles even people accustomed to privilege. Money did not register to her as a resource with boundaries. It was atmosphere. If she wanted something, she assumed it should appear. If it did not, someone had failed her. Elizabeth covered expenses, softened consequences, and defended her daughter against criticism, even when the criticism was deserved. That is one of the quieter tragedies in families like this. Affection and denial often become indistinguishable. Around the edges of the household, relatives whispered the usual things: nature or nurture, blood or upbringing. Was Marjorie damaged by what came before adoption, or had Elizabeth's indulgence made her impossible? It was the sort of question families ask when they want analysis to substitute for action. Whatever the origin, the result was the same. By the time Marjorie reached adulthood, her temperament was no longer a phase, it was a fact. In 1951, at 19, she married Richard Loy. He seems to have been decent, hardworking, and entirely unprepared for the life he was entering. Marriage might have steadied her. Motherhood might have imposed discipline. That is the old hope, especially among respectable families. Responsibility will reform what character would not. Instead, the responsibilities multiplied faster than the character required to bear them. 7 children arrived. So did the bills. The Loy household, settled in Marine on Street Croix, should have looked stable from the outside. It was the sort of place where people raised families, paid mortgages, and performed ordinary middle-class ambition. But inside, crisis became the family's normal weather. Money went out faster than it came in. Debts accumulated. Payments were missed. Creditors called. Collection notices arrived. Richard worked more. Marjorie blamed him for not earning enough. The marriage became a long argument with numbers that never added up. And always there was Elizabeth. Every emergency, every late bill, every financial humiliation found its way back to Glensheen, Marjorie asked. Elizabeth paid. Sometimes it was framed as help for the grandchildren, sometimes as temporary relief. sometimes as one last rescue before things finally stabilized. But nothing stabilized. The trustees overseeing Congdon wealth watched the pattern with mounting concern. Money went to Marjorie and vanished. It did not build safety. It barely even bought time. Still, Elizabeth insisted. These were her grandchildren. This was her daughter. To refuse felt cruel. To continue was disastrous. She continued. Then came the fire. In the late 1960s, the Loy house burned under circumstances that invited suspicion. The family was heavily burdened by debt. Insurance money would have changed everything in the short term. Questions were raised. Nothing conclusive was ever proven. But in families already trained to notice patterns, the incident lodged in memory. Another crisis, another convenience, another episode orbiting Marjorie in which bad luck and financial desperation seemed to arrive together too neatly. By 1970, Richard had had enough. After 19 years of trying to outrun disorder, he filed for divorce. The marriage collapsed under the weight of money, conflict, and exhaustion. Marjorie initially retained custody, but even that arrangement frayed. Several of the children eventually ended up with Richard because she could not or would not provide a stable life. It was a devastating judgment, though not one delivered in a courtroom. She had not merely failed to manage money, she had failed to create a home. In 1975, she left Minnesota for Colorado, presenting the move as a fresh start. But fresh starts are often simply old patterns in a new landscape. She left most of her children behind and began again with the kind of optimism that tends to appear most brightly in people who have not yet learned to distrust themselves. In Colorado, she met Roger Caldwell, a recently divorced man drifting through odd jobs and financial uncertainty. He was not a figure of power or sophistication. He was, if anything, a man with limited prospects and a dangerous readiness to attach himself to someone else's fantasy. They married in 1976. By then, both were in midlife, both carried failure behind them, and both were broke. Together they produced a new dream, a horse ranch. Not a modest livelihood, but a reinvention. Horses, land, breeding, training, profit. A self-created prosperity that would free Marjorie from dependence on trustees and family scrutiny. It was exactly the kind of plan that sounds plausible only if one is temperamentally unsuited to arithmetic. They bought property, they acquired horses, they borrowed against expectations rather than assets. Everything depended on income that did not yet exist and perhaps never could. Within months, the dream buckled. Payments were missed. The property went into foreclosure. The horses disappeared into repossession or sale. The ranch dissolved almost before it had properly begun. After that, the descent became less elegant and more humiliating. The Caldwells ended up at the Holland House Hotel in Golden, Colorado, living week to week because they could not secure something as ordinary as an apartment lease. Hotel life was expensive, unstable, and fundamentally temporary, but it required less proof. No long-term contract, no confidence from a landlord, just cash. The money came from Marjorie's trust income, roughly $22,000 a year, enough for a modest life if one understood modesty. Marjorie did not. The money evaporated as quickly as it arrived. Hotel charges, meals, shopping, daily leakage, Roger's expenses, the basic cost of trying to maintain appearances without any underlying structure. By the spring of 1977, the situation had turned desperate. Bills were mounting, credit had dried up, Roger was not bringing in meaningful income. The trustees, having seen this drama too many times, refused repeated requests for more money. To them, additional distributions did not solve anything. They simply prolonged collapse. To Marjorie, the refusal felt like imprisonment. Then the story takes on the unmistakable chill of foreknowledge. In March 1977, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation contacted the Congdon trustees with alarming information. Marjorie was said to be looking for someone to kill her mother. The report was serious enough that the family was warned, and security at Glensheen was tightened. Elizabeth, even then, refused to believe it. She insisted there had to be some mistake. Whatever Marjorie had become, she could not accept that it extended to murder. The trustees were less sentimental. They had watched the debts, the manipulation, the fires, the ruined relationships. They understood something Elizabeth resisted understanding. Desperation does not ennoble character, it reveals it. Still, There was little to be done beyond caution. No one could imprison a daughter for rumor. No one could forbid contact without Elizabeth's consent. And Elizabeth, disabled but still emotionally loyal, would not permit it. That loyalty may have been noble. It may also have been fatal. By June, the Caldwells were cornered. The hotel was pressing for payment. There was no viable business, no credit, no rescue left. One fact, however, loomed over everything. Elizabeth's death would release money, a great deal of money. The inheritance locked behind trusts and legal restraint would finally begin to move. Days before Elizabeth was killed, Marjorie signed a power of attorney authorizing Roger to receive a large portion of her expected inheritance directly. Later, that timing would seem almost unbearably revealing. Documents like that are not usually executed on a whim. Then Roger vanished for a weekend. He was not where he was supposed to be. He left behind a plausible explanation, but not a convincing one. A real estate outing, a brief trip, something ordinary. Yet when investigators later began tracing those days, they found an unnerving absence. No reliable witnesses, no clean paper trail, no satisfying account of where he had gone. On Monday morning, June 27, Elizabeth Congdon and her nurse, Velma Piatila, were found dead at Glensheen. Roger reappeared later that day, with bruises on his face and cuts on his hands. His explanation that a horse had kicked him might have been laughable if the circumstances had not been so grave. At the funeral, relatives noticed his injuries, his tension, the way both he and Marjorie seemed somehow misaligned with the grief expected of them. Not dramatic, not openly suspicious, just wrong. It was enough. Family members began telling investigators what they knew: the money problems, the constant demands, the rumors from Colorado, the fire, the trustee's alarm, the inheritance waiting on Elizabeth's death. And once police began pulling at that thread, the case tightened fast. The evidence would ultimately place Roger in direct relation to the crime. That much became increasingly difficult to dispute. The more complicated question, the one that would haunt the case long after the first arrests, was whether Marjorie had merely benefited from the murders or helped imagine them. Did she plan it, encourage it, approve it? Or did Roger, sensing the same financial catastrophe and the same prize, move on his own? That is the question that would divide courtrooms, juries, and public opinion. But by then, one truth was already impossible to ignore. The road to Glensheen had not begun with one violent weekend. It had been laid over decades through indulgence, entitlement, debt, denial, and the corrosive logic of an inheritance large enough to turn family feeling into motive. Duluth detectives began assembling the case almost immediately, while the house was still carrying the shock of what had happened inside it. Glensheen, for all its grandeur, had become a forensic environment. Every room, every surface, every object now had to answer a question. The task was not simply to identify a killer, it was to determine whether the violence belonged to chance or to design. Investigators documented the scene with meticulous care. The broken billiard room window, the scatter of glass, Velma Piatila's body at the foot of the staircase, the warped brass candlestick lying nearby like a brutal punctuation mark. Upstairs, Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom, drawers opened, contents displaced, a jewelry container gone. In 1977, forensic science lacked the technical arsenal that would come later. There was no DNA profile waiting in a laboratory. Cases were built instead through patience, physical detail, and the discipline of noticing what did not fit. And very quickly, several things did not fit. The missing jewelry was one clue. The insufficiency of the theft was another. Glensheen was full of objects. A real burglar would have recognized instantly as valuable. Silver, art, antiques, decorative pieces accumulated over generations. Yet only a narrow selection had been removed. That suggested not greed in the ordinary criminal sense, but theater, a scene arranged to imply robbery without fully committing to it. Then there was Velma Piatila's car, discovered the next day in airport parking with the keys still inside. It was an odd choice, unless the purpose was escape or the appearance of escape. Detectives began chasing the obvious possibility that the killer had driven to the airport, boarded a plane, and vanished back west. Passenger lists were reviewed. Flights between Minnesota and Colorado were checked. Credit card activity was examined. Nothing cleanly placed Roger Caldwell on a plane. No ticket, no receipt, no tidy travel record. If he had made the trip, He had done so in a way that left surprisingly little bureaucratic residue. But as that avenue remained murky, other evidence sharpened. About a week after the murders, a coin dealer in Colorado contacted authorities after receiving a mailed request to evaluate a Byzantine gold coin. The return address traced back to Roger Caldwell. The coin appeared consistent with items from Elizabeth Congdon's collection. It was the kind of detail that feels almost too incriminating to be true, either astonishingly careless or perversely confident. A search of the Caldwell's hotel room produced more trouble. Jewelry matching descriptions of items missing from Glensheen and a wicker container resembling the missing box. Roger offered explanations, but they had the thinness of stories invented too late. Then came the fingerprint. On the envelope used to mail the coin was a thumbprint identified as Roger Caldwell's. It became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the case. Tactile, direct, almost embarrassingly concrete. However, the defense might challenge motive or timeline. A fingerprint on mail containing property tied to a murder scene is difficult to romanticize away. The visual evidence was no less persuasive. When Roger and Marjorie arrived in Duluth for Elizabeth's funeral, people noticed him immediately. Bruises, cuts, marks on his hands and face. Marjorie moved quickly to explain them away, some accident involving a horse, but the explanation satisfied almost no one. He did not look like a man inconvenienced by bad luck. He looked like a man who had recently been close to violence. Separate interviews did the Caldwells no favors. Their stories drifted. Roger could not clearly account for his whereabouts over the crucial weekend. Marjorie claimed he had been with her on real estate errands, but that account frayed when others failed to place him there. The small contradictions were more damaging than dramatic lies might have been. They created the impression not of innocence under pressure, but of improvisation. Roger was arrested first, charged with the murders of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatila. He denied everything and insisted he was being set up. The argument, at least in theory, was simple. Someone else had committed the crime and arranged the evidence to point toward him. But the material against him kept accumulating. Fibers, objects, inconsistencies, physical injuries, financial desperation, and the mounting logic of the case all converged in one direction. Marjorie presented a more difficult problem. Investigators believed she was central to the motive, perhaps even to the plan, but belief is not proof. She had not been inside Glensheen that night. She had left no fingerprints on a murder weapon, no direct physical trace in the rooms where the killings occurred. The case against her had to be built differently through money, behavior, timing, and pattern. That is where the financial records became so important. Days before the murders, she had signed documents positioning Roger to receive a substantial share of her expected inheritance. There were also older shadows, suspicious episodes, family testimony, stories of manipulation, the sense hard to quantify but impossible to ignore, that chaos and financial need followed her with unusual fidelity. One of her own daughters gave investigators a deeply troubling portrait of her capacity for cruelty. Piece by piece, prosecutors began constructing not merely a murder case, but a domestic history of appetite. Roger's trial came first. By then, the prosecution had a strong physical narrative. Stolen property in his possession, his fingerprint on the mailed envelope, visible injuries, no convincing account of his whereabouts, and a motive tied to a fortune that would unlock upon Elizabeth's death. The defense tried to break that narrative by arguing fabrication, family intrigue, even the possibility that other Congdons had reason to redirect suspicion. But there were too many facts that sat too heavily in the room. The jury convicted him. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 life sentences. That verdict gave prosecutors confidence, but not certainty. Roger had been easier. Roger had touched things. Roger had bled into the edges of the story. Marjorie would be another matter entirely. She had money, counsel, family standing, and the single greatest advantage any defendant can have in a circumstantial case: distance from the actual scene. Her trial would not be about whether something terrible had happened. It would be about whether the state could prove that ambition, resentment, and inheritance had traveled from her mind into another person's hands. Marjorie Congdon Caldwell went on trial in the spring of 1979 in a courtroom far from Duluth, but still under the long shadow of Glensheen. The venue had been moved, as everyone understood it would be. The murders had saturated northern Minnesota so completely that the case no longer belonged only to the family or the prosecutors. It had entered public folklore. But changing counties did not change the essential problem facing the state. Roger Caldwell had been easier to place inside the crime. He left traces. He had the injuries, the stolen property, the physical gravity of a man who had passed too close to violence. Marjorie was different. Marjorie had not been in the mansion that night. She had not stood over Velma Piatila with a candlestick or over Elizabeth Congdon with a pillow. To convict her, the prosecution had to persuade a jury of something more abstract, and therefore more difficult, that the murders began in her mind. Their case rested on motive, timing, and pattern. The motive was stark enough. Marjorie's finances were in ruins. Debt had swallowed one life after another. She had been cut off, restrained, reduced to pleading with trustees who no longer trusted her. Yet on paper, a fortune waited just beyond reach. Elizabeth's death would unlock millions. And just days before the killings, Marjorie had signed documents positioning Roger to receive a large share of that expected inheritance. It was not proof in the narrow sense, but it carried the chill of anticipation. The prosecutors widened the frame. They brought forward prior incidents, rumors, family testimony, stories of desperation and manipulation. A daughter spoke against her own mother. Old suspicions resurfaced. Small, ugly episodes that might once have seemed isolated were now recast as fragments of a larger design. The state's argument was cumulative. No single piece carried the whole burden, but taken together, the pattern was difficult to dismiss. The defense understood immediately that facts alone would not decide the case. Marjorie's lawyer, Ron Meshbesher, was too skilled for that. He recognized that a circumstantial prosecution can be defeated not only by contradiction, but by atmosphere. So he changed the atmosphere. Marjorie appeared in court, not as a mastermind of inheritance murder, but as a composed, middle-aged woman in modest clothes, quiet and almost subdued. She sat knitting. It was a brilliant stroke. Juries do not evaluate evidence in a vacuum. They evaluate people. And the image before them was not of a Gothic heiress conspiring for money, but of someone ordinary, even vulnerable. Meshbesher's argument was disciplined and devastatingly simple. Roger may have killed Elizabeth and Velma, but where was the proof that Marjorie ordered it? Where was the recorded conversation, the letter, the witness to a plan? Suspicion, however strong, was not enough. In a case built on inference, doubt could do almost all the work. Marjorie herself took the stand and proved to be more effective than many expected. She spoke of her mother with grief, of adoption with hurt, of family rejection with practiced tenderness. She insisted Roger had acted without her knowledge. She cast herself not as architect, but as collateral damage, a daughter bereaved, a wife ruined, a woman swallowed by scandal. The jury acquitted her. The verdict stunned much of the family and satisfied almost no one outside the courtroom who had followed the story closely. Yet the law had spoken with finality. Roger was guilty, Marjorie was not. In legal terms, that was the end of it. In moral terms, it was the beginning of another kind of permanence, the unresolved suspicion that the person most people believed had set the tragedy in motion, had walked back into the world untouched by a conviction. Roger Caldwell entered Stillwater as a man apparently finished. After his 1978 conviction, the sentence was stark. 2 consecutive life terms, no realistic path back into ordinary life, no future beyond prison walls. But criminal cases rarely end when the gavel falls. They continue in briefs, appeals, procedural challenges, and the narrow openings defense lawyers spend years trying to force wider. Roger's lawyers eventually found one. During Marjorie's later trial, testimony had surfaced that Roger's jury had never heard material the defense argued might have altered the outcome. In 1982, the Minnesota Supreme Court agreed enough to do something extraordinary. It overturned his conviction and ordered a new trial. It was not an exoneration. It was something more destabilizing. The case had not collapsed, but it had lost its clean edges. That ruling put prosecutors in an awkward position. Too much time had passed. Memories had softened. Witnesses could falter. Evidence that once felt decisive might now seem less certain beneath renewed scrutiny. And there was a deeper problem, almost philosophical in its inconvenience. Marjorie had already been acquitted. If she was legally innocent, then how exactly was Roger's motive to be explained? The original theory depended on inheritance and conspiracy. The law had already broken one half of that equation, so the state chose pragmatism over drama. In July 1983, Roger accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and, in exchange, received time served. The bargain required what the system wanted most, a confession on the record. Roger admitted that he had gone to Glensheen, entered through the billiard room window, killed Velma Piatila with the candlestick, gone upstairs, and smothered Elizabeth Congdon in her bed. The broad architecture of the crime, at last, was no longer in dispute. But the confession was notable for what it did not say. Roger did not implicate Marjorie. He offered no detailed account of planning, no whispered instructions, no explicit claim that she had set the murders in motion. Formally, he took the whole burden onto himself. To many observers, that version of events felt implausibly neat. Roger did not seem like a man who had invented a crime of such cold usefulness alone. Yet the courts had already sorted the roles as far as the law was concerned. Roger was guilty, Marjorie was not. Reality, if it differed, would remain unofficial. Roger walked out of prison, a free man in legal terms, and a ruined one in every other sense. He had spent 5 years carrying one of the most infamous crimes in Minnesota, and freedom did not return him to anonymity. He was marked now by the murders, by the confession, by the suspicion that he had either taken orders or protected someone who let him fall. In 1988, he died by suicide. No final revelation came with it. Whatever he truly knew about the planning of the murders died with him. Marjorie, meanwhile, kept moving through the world in the same troubled pattern. Restricted trust income replaced the fortune she had expected. There were more arrests, more accusations, more disorder, arson, fraud, theft, the usual wreckage of a life that never learned restraint. Her children drifted away. Jennifer did not. Jennifer remained the stable daughter, the one whose life resembled inheritance rather than damage. And Glensheen endured. Open to the public, preserved almost intact, it became what Chester Congdon had wanted in one sense and failed to secure in another. The house survived. The family did not. That is the final cruelty of places like Glensheen. Stone, wood, and gardens can outlast scandal, but bloodlines rarely survive themselves so gracefully. Marjorie Congdon Caldwell did not vanish after the trials. She simply kept moving through the wreckage in the same way she always had, leaving behind suspicion, estrangement, and the low-grade chaos that had followed her for decades. Roger's death closed nothing. If anything, it fixed the mystery in place. Marjorie remained alive, legally untouchable, publicly notorious, and endlessly insistent on her own innocence. She drifted west, eventually settling in Arizona, putting geographic distance between herself and Minnesota, between herself and Glensheen, between herself and the name that had made and ruined her. But distance is not absolution. There were more allegations, more arrests, more small degradations of character made visible in court records instead of family whispers. Fraud, forgery, theft, the crimes grew smaller as the years went on, almost pitiful in scale, but in another sense more revealing. The woman long suspected of arranging a fortune-driven murder kept returning to the same compulsions, taking what was not hers, improvising, surviving badly. By then, her children were largely gone from her life. The family breach never healed. Rebecca never came back. Jennifer, her adopted sister, remained convinced to the end that Marjorie had been responsible for Elizabeth's death. Others reached similar conclusions, privately or in print. The law had acquitted her, but acquittal is not vindication, and public memory rarely obeys courtroom standards. Marjorie could deny everything for the rest of her life, and she did. The denial changed nothing. Meanwhile, Glensheen entered its second life. Under the University of Minnesota Duluth, the estate was preserved with an almost paradoxical tenderness. Rooms were restored, gardens maintained, tours expanded. The house kept astonishingly close to the world Chester and Clara Congdon had made in 1908. Visitors came first for the architecture, the interiors, the rare intactness of an American great house. Some came for the murders. Eventually, the institution accepted that both stories belonged there. The crime was not the whole meaning of Glensheen, but it could not be excised from it either. That is the final irony, and perhaps the sharpest one. Chester built Glensheen to secure a dynasty. The dynasty failed, the fortune scattered, the family fractured beyond repair. But the house survived beautifully, publicly, almost triumphantly. Stone, wood, and designed landscape proved more durable than blood. What greed could not inherit, preservation saved. In the end, Glensheen outlived everyone who tried to possess it. The people collapsed, the architecture remained. And that, more than the verdicts, may be the truest ending to the story.